In 1808, a cook on a South Carolina plantation hid okra seeds in the hem of her apron. 40 years later, those same seeds were still feeding her grandchildren. Most Americans have no idea what enslaved people actually ate. Hollywood shows you the big house dining room. The truth happened behind the smokehouse after dark, in dirt floor cabins lit by a single tallow candle. Number 14 was so important to West African tradition that women smuggled it across the Atlantic in their hair. Number 3 is now a $30 plate at Charleston restaurants. These 20 foods were cooked in secret because survival demanded it. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 20 forgotten foods slaves cooked in secret on southern plantations. Number 20. Ash cakes. Before they had skillets, before they had ovens, before they had anything resembling a real kitchen, enslaved people had ashes. A handful of cornmeal mixed with water and a pinch of salt was patted into a flat, round cake, wrapped in a cabbage or collard leaf, and pushed directly into the dying coals at the edge of the fireplace. 30 minutes later, the cook would brush away the ashes and unwrap something dense, smoky, and warm. Ash cakes cost nothing. The cornmeal was the weekly ration. The leaves came from the garden patch. The ashes were already there. For families finishing fieldwork after sundown, this was supper made by lamplight while children slept on pallets nearby. The smoke flavor was deep and bitter at the edges, mellow in the center. It tasted of the fire that cooked it. Today, ash cakes appear in exactly 2 restaurants in America. For 200 years, they appeared on every plantation in the South. Number 19. Hoa cakes. The hoe was a tool of forced labor by day. After sunset, it became something else. Field hands would heat the flat metal blade of a hoe over an open flame in the quarters, oil it with a piece of fatback, and ladle on a batter of cornmeal, water, and salt. The cake would sizzle and brown in minutes. You flipped it with a knife or a stick. You ate it standing up because there was no time to sit. A single hoe cake cost nothing. The cornmeal came from the master's rations. The hoe came from the field. The fire was already burning to keep the children warm. This was the food that fueled the people who built the cotton economy of the American South. The taste was simple, almost sweet from the corn itself, with a crisp golden crust from the hot metal. Today we call them Johnny cakes and charge $8 for them at brunch. The name and the price changed. The recipe never did. Number 18. Pot liquor. When white plantation kitchens cooked greens, they threw away the cooking water. Enslaved cooks knew better. That dark, mineral-rich liquid left at the bottom of the pot. What generations of black Southerners would come to call pot liquor contained more nutrition than the greens themselves. Iron, calcium, vitamins, all of it leached into the water during the long simmer with smoked pork. Mothers would ladle pot liquor into tin cups for sick children and tired field workers. They would crumble cornbread into it and call it supper. They would save it overnight to drink cold the next morning. A doctor in 1854 wrote about enslaved patients who recovered from illness on pot liquor and nothing else. He did not understand why. The cooks did. That dark broth, secretly sustaining generations of working people, was one of the great unwritten medicines of the American South. It still is, if you know to ask for it. Number 17. Hot water cornbread. On nights when there was no time for the slow rise of biscuits or the wait for ash cakes, enslaved cooks made hot water cornbread. The recipe was 3 things: cornmeal, salt, boiling water poured directly into the meal until it formed a thick paste. The hot water gelatinized the starches, creating a tender interior with a crisp exterior that no other technique could match. Patties were dropped into hot fat in a cast iron skillet and fried until deep golden. 5 minutes, start to finish. Hot water cornbread fed children who would otherwise have gone to bed hungry. It used the smallest amount of fat possible. The cornmeal swelled to twice its volume when bound with hot water, meaning the same weekly ration stretched further. Field hands carried cold, hot water cornbread in their pockets the next day, eating it without warming. Just bread and salt and the memory of last night's fire. Number 16. Hoppin' John. The dish that would eventually appear on every New Year's table in the American South began as a survival meal in the slave quarters of Carolina rice country. Black-eyed peas, brought from West Africa in the holds of slave ships, simmered with rice and a piece of salt pork or a smoked pig's foot. The peas swelled, the rice absorbed the broth, and the pork seasoned everything with smoke and salt. A pound of dried peas cost the planter almost nothing. The rice was grown by the very people eating it, often in marshes they had cleared themselves. Hoppin' John was eaten quietly in cabins after the master's house had gone dark. The name itself is debated. Some say it comes from a French Caribbean phrase. Others trace it to the dance children did when they smelled it cooking. What is certain is that this dish carried West African food culture into the American South and made it permanent. Today, it is celebrated. Then, it was hidden. Number 15. Okra soup. First pattern break. Here is where the story gets specific. Okra is not an American plant. It came from West Africa in the early 1600s, brought by enslaved women who carried seeds in their hair, in the hems of clothing, in the linings of head wraps. They knew exactly what they were doing. Okra was a staple of Senegambian and Yoruba cooking, used to thicken soups and stews in a way no European ingredient could replicate. On plantations across the Low Country, enslaved cooks grew okra in the small garden patches they were allowed to tend after dark. They cooked it into a soup with tomatoes, onions, and whatever scrap of meat they could find. The pods released a silky, thickening agent that gave the broth body. Eaten over rice, okra soup was a complete meal. It was also a connection to a homeland most of them would never see again. Every spoonful was an act of memory. Number 14. Bena seeds. This is what was smuggled across the Atlantic. Bene is the West African word for sesame. Enslaved women in Senegal and Sierra Leone considered bena seeds sacred. They believed planting them in a new land would bring luck and protection. On Carolina plantations, those women planted bene wherever they could hide it. Along fence lines, in the corners of garden patches, in the cracks between cabin foundations. They roasted the tiny seeds in iron skillets until they smelled like toasted bread. They ground them into pastes for soups. They mixed them with sugar and molasses to make bene brittle and bene wafers, a treat for children who otherwise had nothing sweet. Today, bene wafers are sold in Charleston for $20 a tin. They are marketed as a Southern specialty. They are, but the South that created them was not the South of plantation owners. It was the South of women who refused to let their grandmothers' kitchens die. Number 13. Chitterlings. After hog killing season in November, the master's household kept the best cuts, the hams, the shoulders, the bacon. What they did not want, what they considered waste, went to the slave quarters, the intestines. Enslaved cooks knew exactly what to do with them. The cleaning alone took half a day. The intestines had to be turned inside out, scraped, soaked in vinegar water, rinsed 7 times, and inspected for any trace of contamination. Then they were simmered for hours with onions, vinegar, and red pepper until they turned tender, and the smell, sharp and unmistakable, filled the entire row of cabins. Eaten with hot sauce and cornbread, chitterlings, or chitlins as they came to be called, were a feast. They appeared on Christmas Day, at births, on the rare days when a community could gather and remember they were human. The food was free because nobody else wanted it. The transformation of that food was a quiet act of dignity. Number 12. Cracklins. Nothing from the hog was wasted. The fat that did not go into the master's lard barrel went into the cabins, where it was rendered slowly in iron pots until the solid pieces of skin and meat floated to the top, golden and crackling. Those pieces, drained and salted, were cracklins. Children ate them by the handful. Adults crumbled them into cornbread batter to make crackling bread, the most flavorful loaf the slave quarters ever produced. The fat that remained, the lard, was the cooking medium for everything else. A single hog could produce 10 pounds of cracklins and 40 pounds of lard, enough to last a family for months. The smell of rendering fat hung over the quarters every November like a kind of incense. It meant winter was coming. It also meant nobody would starve before spring. Number 11. Smothered greens. Collard greens, mustard greens, turnip greens, dandelion greens. Anything green and bitter that could be found growing wild or in a kitchen garden went into the pot. The technique was specific. The greens were washed 3 times to remove every trace of sand. The stems were stripped out by hand. The leaves were torn into pieces. Then they were dropped into a pot with a chunk of smoked pork covered with water and simmered until the bitterness softened into something deep and earthy. 2 hours minimum. 3 was better. The pork seasoned the greens seasoned the pork. The pot liquor at the bottom became the medicine. Greens cooked this way are one of the few American dishes that scientists now know retain more nutrition through long cooking than through quick steaming. Enslaved cooks did not have studies. They had results. The greens kept their families alive through winters when nothing else grew. Number 10. Ash-roasted sweet potatoes. Second pattern break. Here is something the historical record almost lost entirely. Sweet potatoes were the perfect plantation food. They grew in poor soil. They stored for months in dirt floor cellars. They could be cooked with no equipment at all. The simplest preparation, and the one most often documented in slave narratives, was to bury a sweet potato directly in the coals of a dying fire. An hour later, the cook would dig it out, brush off the ashes, and split it open. The flesh inside would be deep orange, almost candy sweet, with a smoky char from the coals. Sometimes a child would receive a whole potato as a treat. Sometimes the family would share one, eating it with their fingers, the skin licked clean. Field workers carried cooled sweet potatoes in their pockets through the cotton rows the next day. This was lunch. This was supper. This was the most reliable food on the plantation for 200 years. Number 9. Peanut soup. The peanut, like okra, traveled from West Africa in the holds of slave ships. In Senegal and Mali, ground peanut stew called mafi was a staple. On Virginia and Carolina plantations, enslaved cooks recreated it with whatever was available. They roasted peanuts over a fire, ground them on a flat stone, and stirred the paste into broth with onions, tomatoes, and a piece of smoked pork. The result was thick, creamy, and deeply nutty, a soup that filled the belly and warmed the bones on cold nights. Peanut soup required no expensive ingredients. The peanuts were grown in garden patches and slave plots, often in soil considered too poor for cotton. The dish appeared throughout the antebellum South, then traveled with the Great Migration to northern cities. Today, a similar dish is served at Mount Vernon and called colonial peanut soup. The history attached to it is more complicated than that name suggests. Number 8. Possum and sweet potatoes. At night, enslaved men would set traps in the woods at the edges of the plantation. They were not allowed to hunt with guns. They were not allowed to be off the property after dark. They did it anyway because the food they were given was not enough. Possum was the catch. The meat was dark, gamey, and rich in fat. It was cleaned, parboiled to remove the strong flavor, then roasted in a covered pot with sweet potatoes, onions, and salt. The sweet potatoes absorbed the rendered fat from the possum and turned to a dark, caramelized softness. The meat fell apart at the touch of a fork. This was a feast meal. It happened maybe once a month, when a trap finally caught something. The whole cabin gathered. The smell was extraordinary. The children remembered it their entire lives. Possum and sweet potatoes appeared in Southern cookbooks well into the 1950s. Today, almost no one alive has tasted it. Number 7. Red rice. In the rice fields of South Carolina and Georgia, enslaved people from the rice-growing regions of West Africa, Senegambia, Sierra Leone, and the Gambia were considered the most valuable labor a planter could own. They knew how to grow rice. The planters did not. What the planters also did not know was that those same workers were cooking rice the way their grandmothers had taught them. Red rice, the dish that would eventually become Charleston red rice, was the southern version of Senegalese jollof. Rice simmered in tomato broth with onion, smoked meat, and red pepper until every grain absorbed the color and the flavor. The technique was specific. The rice had to be parboiled separately, then steamed in the seasoned liquid. The bottom layer formed a crust, brown and toasted, considered the best part. Red rice fed entire communities at gatherings in the slave quarters. Today, it is the signature dish of low country cuisine, served in restaurants where the prices would have astonished the women who invented it. Number 6. Pickled pig's feet. What the master's kitchen would not touch, the slave cabins transformed. Pig's feet were considered inedible by white Southern cooks of the early 1800s. They were cartilage. They were tendon. They were almost no meat at all. Enslaved cooks figured out that the very thing that made pig's feet unappealing, the high collagen content, was also what made them magical. Simmered slowly for hours, then submerged in vinegar with onions, salt, and pepper, pig's feet pickled into something tangy, gelatinous, and dense with flavor. They kept in a stoneware crock for months without refrigeration. They became travel food, road food, the thing you reached for when you had nothing else. Pickled pig's feet sustained families through long winters and longer journeys. They sustained communities through the entire Great Migration, when black families traveled north with crocks of pickled pork to make sure they would arrive with something familiar in their stomachs. Number 5. Souse. Souse, or hog-head cheese, was the most labor-intensive food on this list, and also one of the most economical. The head of a slaughtered hog, considered waste by the planter's kitchen, would be cleaned and split by enslaved cooks. The skin, the cheeks, the tongue, the ears, every bit of meat and connective tissue would be simmered for hours until the meat fell off the bone and the broth became rich with collagen. The meat was chopped fine, seasoned heavily with vinegar, pepper, and sage, returned to a portion of the broth, and packed into a mold. As it cooled, the collagen would set, holding everything together in a sliceable loaf. Souse was Sunday food. It was sliced thin and eaten with cornbread or biscuits. It traveled well. It kept for weeks in a cool cellar. Today, souse is sold in glass jars in some southern groceries. Most people walk past it. They do not know what it cost in labor and skill to create. Number 4. Catfish stew. The rivers that ran past the plantations were full of catfish, and catfish were considered trash by white anglers. Enslaved men fished them at night with handmade lines and cane poles, often in places they were not supposed to be. The catfish were cleaned, gutted, and dropped into a pot with onions, potatoes, tomatoes, and bacon, then simmered until the fish broke into pale flakes through the broth. The meat was sweet, slightly muddy in the way that river fish always are, and the broth tasted of smoke and tomato and pepper. Catfish stew fed entire cabins on Friday nights when the fishing was good. It was poured over rice. It was eaten with cornbread. It was an entire summer's worth of suppers for families who learned to read the river the way other people read books. Catfish would not become a respectable American food until the 1980s. By then, generations had already eaten it in secret. Number 3. Gumbo. Third pattern break. Here is the dish that became the symbol of Louisiana, the dish that defines New Orleans cuisine, the dish that costs $30 in restaurants in the French Quarter. It was created by enslaved cooks in West African kitchens that happened to be located in the American South. The word gumbo comes from the Bantu word for okra. Keen gumbo. The technique of thickening a stew with okra is West African. The technique of using file powder, dried sassafras leaves, came from the Choctaw and was adopted by black cooks who learned the trade from indigenous people who lived nearby. The roux, the dark flour and fat base, came from French Creole influences, but was perfected in slave kitchens where cooks had to work with whatever fat was available. Gumbo is what happens when 3 culinary traditions are forced together in conditions of unspeakable hardship, and a new thing emerges anyway. The stew that resulted is one of the great achievements of American cooking. The people who invented it were never paid for their work. Number 2. Sweet potato pie. The pie that would become the holiday centerpiece of black households across America began in the slave cabins of the antebellum South. Enslaved cooks were given access to sugar in small amounts, mostly for the master's household, and they hoarded it. They were given access to flour and lard. They had sweet potatoes in abundance from their own garden plots. What they made when these ingredients came together was a pie that was richer, denser, and more deeply flavored than the pumpkin pies of New England. Sweet potatoes were boiled, mashed, mixed with eggs, sugar, butter, and warm spices like nutmeg and cinnamon when they could be obtained. The mixture went into a lard crust and baked until the top cracked slightly and the filling turned a deep orange brown. Sweet potato pie appeared on holidays. It appeared at funerals. It appeared at every gathering where Black families remembered each other after the war ended and the work of being free began. Number 1. Cornbread and clabbered milk. At the top of this list is the meal that more enslaved people ate, more nights than any other food on this list combined. Cornbread baked in a cast iron skillet over an open hearth, crumbled into a bowl of clabbered milk, the thickened, slightly sour milk that formed naturally when fresh milk was left to sit at room temperature. That was supper. The cornbread was the weekly ration of cornmeal made edible. The milk came from a single cow shared among multiple families, allowed to clabber because there was no ice to keep it sweet. The bowl was eaten with a wooden spoon. The cornbread soaked up the milk until it became something between porridge and pudding. Slightly sour, slightly sweet, deeply filling. This was the meal that fed the people who built the American South. This was the meal that appears in slave narrative after slave narrative recorded by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s. This was the meal that no cookbook ever wrote down because nobody who ate it had access to a cookbook. It is gone now. The cows that produced the milk are gone. The skill of reading clabber for the right moment to use it is gone. The hearths are gone. But for 200 years, this bowl was supper. This bowl was childhood. This bowl was home. Here is the challenge. Make one of these this week. The hoe cakes, the Hoppin' John, the smothered greens with pot liquor. Then sit down and eat it slow. Because these were not just recipes, they were survival turned into culture, hardship turned into heritage, and the foundation of every Southern dish you have ever loved. Drop the one you are going to make in the comments. These foods were cooked in secret because they had to be. They do not have to be hidden anymore.